In this lesson, we're going to be launching the web app. So last lesson we left off, we create a function called doGet. doGet is the default function that web apps are going to look for, and it's going to run the code that's contained within the doGet function. So let's continue to build out this function and do a return of a content service. So right now, if we were to deploy the web app, and I'll show you what happens, do a new deployment, select the type in the left-hand side, selecting it as a web app. Let's enter in a description. So test first run. Selecting the web app, who do we want the web app to execute as, and using the account that I'm creating the script with. This is going to allow us to access the sheet data. Otherwise, if you select that the user has to log in, it's going to make the web API that the user has to log in and authenticate on that. So I'm creating just an open web API to get the data. So I'm using the default account. And who has access to the application? So if you're using an organizational unit, you can set that only the organizational unit can see the web URL, only you can see it. There's also anyone with a Google account, so if they're logged into their Google account, they can see it. And because, again, this is going to be an open API that we're just going to be making a fetch request, we're not making any logins, we're connecting to from our website, we're going to keep it as open from anybody. And then let's deploy the web API. It's going to give us a deployment ID as well as a web app URL. So this is an executable URL. You can copy that and open it up in a new tab on your browser. And it's actually not returning anything quite yet. So let's add in some code and return back some content from the sheet data. So setting up and creating what we want to output using the JSON stringify. So this is the same thing that you're going to find in JavaScript. And AppScript uses a lot of the same, or pretty much most of what AppScript has are similar methods to what you would expect with JavaScript. So the JSON stringify is going to turn an object into a string, and we do have an object. So adding into the content here, let's set up the status as true because the user's made a connection to the web endpoint. And also let's output all of the data. We'll create another property value called data, and then from here we'll output the contents of rows. So we want to output, this is the output that we want to show on the web page, and the web content that we're outputting is going to be JSON data, so we want to output it as JSON data. So ultimately we're making a fetch request to it. It's going to see it as JSON data and be able to return it back within our JavaScript code. So do a return, and using the content service class, and the method is going to be that we're using is create text output. So it's creating the text output from output, and just to be sure that it does detect as a JSON file, let's set the meme type, and set the meme type, and here again we need to use the content service and select the meme type enum, and the meme type that we want to use is going to be JSON. So outputting this content as JSON content, and then just close that off and save it. With Google Apps Script and web apps, there's also under the manage deployments and test deployments, you can select the manage deployments and always get the executable URL. The executable URL does have an extension of exec at the end. And also there's an option that we can manage the test deployments. So this is what you would use as you're developing your web app, and it provides you another web URL, and at the end of this it's /dev. So this is your development URL, and the difference between the executable and the development is that unless you redeploy it, it's not going to change the executable, but the development one is going to run whatever live code you have. So at this point we've got our JSON output there, and everything looks correct. So we're ready to redeploy it live, and then that way we can make the connection to the content using the Google Apps script. So we're just outputting it really just as regular JSON data. So we have an option as well if we want to adjust it and loop through the data that we have, we can output. And one of the problems here is, if you see here, one of the first options that we have, it's outputting the content. So it's doing title, content, up, down, because we've selected the whole container area. So we do need to make some adjustments so that we're only getting the data that we want. So let's make some adjustments to it. And we'll call one for headers. And the headers are going to just take whatever the first row of rows is. And there's also selecting out, and if we want to slice out just the data, so just whatever the questions are or content, we can take the rows object and using slice method, so it's the same as JavaScript, so it returns a portion of the array. We want to return the section of the array, so the start number and the end number, and the start number of where we want to return the array is 1, and we want to return back all of the content from the array. We can also do one for headers as well, and using the rows, selecting slice, we can start at 0 and return back the 1. And within the log, let's output what we've got for headers. Actually, that should be headers. And also let's log out what we've got for just the question data. And I'll remove the rows because we don't need to duplicate the output into the log. So now we're outputting the questions and the rows. Let's run that and see what we get within the log. So we do get the first array here of items, and then the next we get the multi-dimensional array, but we've only got the data that we want to use. So if we want to select out that first array, there's actually another way that we can do that, where we can get rows and return back the first set of rows data, and we just need the one bracket there. So running that, it's going to output it as just the one array, whereas here we've got multiple rows, so we want to output all of the questions of rows. So also we want to also include the row number. So let's update the content that we're outputting in questions, and we're going to rebuild it as a more complex object before we redeploy the application. So before the next lesson, go ahead and do the return content service, output the content from the spreadsheet, and output that content into your web app. And as well, select the headers, slice out the questions, and you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson, where we're going to reconstruct the data that we're outputting in a more complex object. That way we can make selections of the content within the object format. So that's coming up next.